They branded her skin with hot iron. They stripped her of her name, her family, her language, everything that made her human. Yet, the world would one day call her saint. The story begins in the burning heart of Africa. The year was somewhere between 1869 and 1870, in a land not yet marked on European maps, a land of red dust, thorny acacia trees, and the slow rhythm of drums that called the sun to sleep. In a small village of the Daju people, among the foothills of Darfur, a little girl played beneath the open sky. Her laughter mingled with the song of birds, her bare feet darkened by the soil that had cradled generations before her. She had no reason to fear the world. Her father was a respected man, a farmer, a community elder. Her mother sang lullabies at night that carried the scent of home and the warmth of firelight. The family's hut was simple, but inside it lived the comfort of belonging. The little girl was not yet old enough to understand the word slavery. To her, the world was endless, an ocean of light and shadow, of days spent chasing goats and nights filled with stories told by the old ones under the stars. Her dreams were small but complete. The next harvest, the next song, the next morning. And then everything changed. It began with rumors, whispers of men on horseback, armed traders from the north, raiders who took children and vanished into the desert. But such stories always felt distant, belonging to someone else's grief. Until one afternoon. The sun was high, a white fire in the sky. The girl and her sister went to the fields carrying baskets of millet. They were laughing when the wind changed. It carried the sound of hooves, first faint, then thunderous. She turned and saw them, dark silhouettes cutting across the horizon. Her sister grabbed her hand. They ran. The air filled with shouting. A horse closed in behind them. The ground trembled beneath its weight. She tried to scream, but a hand struck her face. Everything went black. When she awoke, she was bound. Her wrists burned from rope. Around her, strangers spoke in a language she didn't know. Her sister was gone. Her world had ended. For days, they marched through the desert. The heat was merciless. When she fell, they beat her. When she cried, they laughed. The tears dried before they could reach her chin. Those who could not walk were left behind. Some collapsed and were covered by sand within minutes. She learned not to look back. They reached the first market, a place of noise and smoke where lives were measured by silver coins. The girl watched as people were bought and sold, her heart too young to understand the cruelty, but old enough to feel the fear. A man examined her arms, her teeth, her height, then nodded. She was sold for the first time. The man who bought her owned others, women, children, men too broken to stand straight. They worked his fields, cooked his food, obeyed his every command. The girl did what she was told. She learned quickly that silence meant survival. She was given a new name, Bakhita, the fortunate one. The irony was sharp, but she did not yet know it. She only knew that her real name, the one her mother had whispered at birth, was forbidden. It faded from her memory, lost to the wind. The beatings came often, sometimes for mistakes, sometimes for nothing at all. The scars formed patterns across her back, shoulders, and legs. Each line was a lesson in pain. When she was not working, she dreamed. She dreamed of home, her sister's laughter, her mother's songs. But the dreams always ended the same way, with the sound of hooves and the desert swallowing her voice. Years blurred together. She was sold again, then again. One master carved marks into her skin, 114 deep cuts, filled with salt to keep them open, to ensure the design would remain forever. The pain was beyond anything she had known. But when it was over, she did not cry. She simply closed her eyes and waited for the next dawn. Sometimes she wondered if death would come in the night, but it never did. It seemed even death had forgotten her. When she turned 14, her last master's house stood near the city of El Obeid. The city smelled of spices and dust, of sweat and iron. Traders spoke of a new kind of power, men from across the sea who came with ships, with strange clothing and strange laws. Some said they were kind, others said they bought slaves just like everyone else. One afternoon, while serving water to visitors, she saw a man with pale skin and a trimmed beard. His clothes were unlike the others. He spoke with calm authority, his words translated by the servants. This was Signor Callisto Legnani, the Italian consul. For reasons she never understood, he looked at her not as property, but as a person. He saw the fear in her eyes and did not strike her for it. When his business ended, he spoke to her master, and she was sold again, this time to him. It was her 6th sale. But something was different. He treated her gently, gave her food, allowed her to rest. When she made mistakes, he did not raise his hand. For the first time in her life, she tasted what it felt like to be safe, or at least safer than before. Still, she waited for cruelty. It always came eventually. But months passed, and it didn't. The consul even allowed her to keep a small wooden cross, though she did not yet understand what it meant. When the consul's assignment in Sudan ended, he told her they would travel to Italy. She didn't know where that was, only that it meant crossing the sea. The night before they left, she stood outside under the stars. The desert stretched endlessly. Somewhere beyond the dunes lay the village of her birth, or what was left of it. She whispered into the wind, "If you can hear me, I am alive." Then she turned toward the horizon. The ship left at dawn. The sea was unlike anything she had imagined, blue beyond belief, deep and endless. She stood at the deck, her skin cold from the spray of salt. The sound of waves replaced the sound of chains. She did not know if she was being freed or taken to another kind of captivity. But inside her, a strange feeling stirred, something she had not felt in years. Hope. Italy was another world. The sky was softer, the air smelled of rain and bread. The people were curious but not cruel. They called her La Moreta, the little dark one. She did not understand their words, but their eyes did not carry hatred. In Venice, she was left in the care of a family connected to the consul. They treated her well enough, but she was still a servant. Then, one day when the family had to travel, they left her temporarily in the custody of a group of women, the Canossian sisters. It was here that everything changed. The convent was quiet, filled with light that fell through narrow windows. The sisters spoke softly, their kindness unfamiliar. They taught her to read, to write, to sew. They did not strike her when she stumbled over words. They smiled instead. She learned of a man named Jesus who had suffered without hate, who had forgiven even his tormentors. She did not know what to make of this story. But when she saw the crucifix, a man nailed to wood, eyes lifted toward heaven, she felt something break open inside her. She had seen suffering, but never like this, chosen, endured, and transformed. She thought of her own scars, her own pain, and wondered if perhaps there was meaning hidden within it. When her old owners returned from Africa and demanded her back, the sisters refused. They told her that in Italy, slavery no longer existed, that she was free. The words struck her like thunder. Free. In the courtroom, she stood trembling as the judge spoke. The verdict was simple. She belonged to no one. For a moment, she didn't move. The world went silent. Then, slowly, she fell to her knees and wept. That day, Josephine Bakhita, once a nameless slave, became her own. She chose to stay with the sisters. She chose baptism, taking the name Josephine Margaret Fortunata Bakhita, the fortunate one, this time by her own will. She was no longer a shadow. She was light. The convent in Venice became her new world. Its corridors smelled of wax and bread, its walls old and quiet, its bells marking the rhythm of every day. Dawn came with a chill, the kind that crept through stone, and yet within those walls she felt warmth unlike anything she had ever known. For the first time in her life, no one owned her. The only voice that commanded her was the sound of the bell calling her to prayer. She woke before sunrise. She knelt on the cold floor of the chapel, her hands clasped, eyes closed. The candles flickered against the bronze of her skin. Her breath came slowly, a rhythm of gratitude. She prayed in silence, not because someone told her to, but because silence itself had become sacred. The sisters taught her their ways, to work, to serve, to speak the language of faith. They told her she was safe, but even safety was something she had to learn. At night, she still woke in fear, reaching for a whip that no longer existed. Sometimes she cried quietly, ashamed that the body remembered what the soul wanted to forget. They told her stories from the scriptures, stories of women who had suffered and endured, of Mary, of Ruth, of Esther. She listened, eyes wide, as if hearing echoes of her own life hidden in ancient words. And when they read the Passion of Christ, the scourging, the cross, the forgiveness, she felt something stir deep inside her. It was not pain, not sorrow, but recognition. She asked one of the sisters, "Why would he forgive them?" The sister smiled gently. Because love cannot survive with hate. That night, she lay awake, repeating those words. Love cannot survive with hate. The idea frightened her. She had built her life on silence, not love. But now, love was beginning to rebuild her. As months turned to years, she grew into her new name, Josephine Bakhita. The sisters discovered she had a gift for tenderness. She cared for the sick, comforted the dying, soothed the frightened children who came to the orphanage. Her presence brought calm. When others despaired, she smiled. When others wept, she listened. Some of the younger sisters whispered that her patience was supernatural, but to her, it was not patience. It was survival. After so many years of cruelty, peace felt like a miracle, and she refused to waste it. She took her vows in 1896. The ceremony was simple. She stood before the altar, hands trembling slightly. The priest asked her name. Sister Josephine Margaret Fortunata Bakhita, she replied, her voice soft but certain. The sound filled the chapel like the first note of a song long awaited. From that day on, she belonged only to God, yet even that belonging was freedom. Her days followed the rhythm of devotion. Prayer before sunrise, work after breakfast, study in the afternoons, silence after dusk. She worked in the kitchen, the laundry, the garden. She scrubbed floors until her knees ached, but she never complained. When others apologized for giving her hard tasks, she smiled and said, "I worked harder once, for no love at all." The other sisters often found her humming while she worked, small, haunting melodies from her childhood in Sudan. No one understood the words, but they understood the feeling. They said her songs made the convent feel alive. As years passed, visitors began to arrive. Some were priests, some wealthy donors, some curious travelers who had heard of the African nun with the scars. They came to see her as if she were a relic from another world. She received them with humility. She never spoke of her suffering unless asked, and when she did, she always ended with forgiveness. One afternoon, a young girl visiting with her family asked her, "Sister, are you angry at those men who hurt you?" Josephine smiled gently and said, "No, child. If I were angry, I would still be their slave." The girl did not understand then, but her mother wept quietly beside her. Josephine's fame grew, though she never sought it. Letters arrived from all over Italy. People wrote to her for blessings, for advice, for prayers. Some called her the Little Black Saint. The church sent scholars to document her life, to record her story as testimony to faith's triumph over despair. Yet, for Josephine, the past was never far. Sometimes at night, the memories returned, the sound of chains, the sting of the whip, the cries of others who had not survived. She would wake, heart racing, and kneel beside her bed. Her lips moved in prayer until her breathing slowed. One of the sisters once found her in the chapel long after midnight, whispering in her old African tongue. When asked what she was saying, she replied, "I am praying for them, the ones still lost." In her later years, she was assigned to the Canossian convent in Schio, a quiet town in northern Italy. The winters there were cold and long, the air heavy with the smell of snow and burning wood. Yet, within those cold walls, she warmed hearts. Children from the village came to visit her often. They were drawn to her kindness, her laughter, the way her eyes seemed to carry both sadness and joy at once. She told them stories of her homeland, not of pain, but of beauty. She spoke of the desert at dawn, the sound of drums, the colors of the sky before rain. The children called her Madre Moreta, the Little Black Mother. To them, she was not a stranger from another continent, but a grandmother who listened, who never raised her voice, who always forgave. Even as she aged, she never stopped working. When arthritis began to twist her fingers, she still insisted on peeling vegetables, sweeping floors, polishing the brass candlesticks. When pain seized her joints, she whispered, "Each pain is a step toward heaven." War came again. The world outside the convent grew violent. Soldiers marched through the streets, bombs fell, people fled. But Josephine stayed. When the sirens wailed, she prayed. When frightened villagers knocked at the convent door, she welcomed them. One winter night, a family arrived, a mother, a child, a wounded father. Josephine bandaged the man's leg, boiled soup for them, and whispered to the child who trembled in fear, "Do not be afraid. The storm will pass. It always does." The next morning, the family was gone, leaving only a note. "Thank you, sister. You have shown us what mercy looks like." Even the soldiers began to speak of her. Some came secretly to the chapel, asking for her prayers. She never refused. To her, all souls were equal. After the war, her health began to fail. The years of labor and hardship had left deep marks on her body. Her back was bent, her hands stiff. Yet her spirit remained unbroken. She never complained, never asked for rest. When others told her to sit, she said, "There will be time to rest when I am home." One of the sisters asked her once, "Sister Josephine, what do you see when you close your eyes?" She smiled faintly and said, "Light and my mother's face." Her final months were spent mostly in her small room, a simple cell with a bed, a crucifix, and a window that looked toward the garden. She could no longer walk without help, but she still prayed every morning. The villagers came to visit her, bringing flowers, food, and their sorrows. She listened, held their hands, and said, "God knows your pain. Give it to him." As the winter of 1947 deepened, she grew weaker. The sisters gathered around her bedside. Her breathing was shallow, but her eyes were clear. She looked at each of them, one by one, and whispered, "Be good. Love one another. Forgive." Then, after a long silence, she said softly, "Yes." The sisters asked, "Yes to what?" She smiled and whispered, "Yes, I'm going to my master." She died peacefully on February 8, 1947. Outside, snow was falling. The convent bell rang, slow and solemn. The world had lost a servant, but gained a saint. Her funeral was simple. Villagers filled the small chapel, their candles flickering in the cold air. Some wept openly. Others knelt in silent gratitude. The priest spoke briefly. "She who was once a slave now walks free in the kingdom of God." They buried her in Schio. Her tomb was plain, marked only by her name, but soon people began to come. They brought flowers, letters, prayers. Some said they felt warmth near her grave. Others claimed miracles. To those who had known her, none of this was surprising. They had already seen the miracle of her life. Years later, the church began to investigate her cause for sainthood. Witnesses spoke of her kindness, her faith, her serenity. One sister said, "When you looked into her eyes, you saw God's mercy looking back." In the year 2000, Pope John Paul II canonized her as Saint Josephine Bakhita, the first African woman to be declared a saint in modern times. The crowd in St. Peter's Square stood in awe as her name was proclaimed. Her image, radiant and serene, was raised high above the altar. The Pope's voice echoed through the square. She teaches us that freedom is not something that others give or take. True freedom is born in the heart. In that moment, the world remembered her not as a slave, not as a victim, but as a beacon, a reminder that even the deepest suffering can become light. And somewhere, in the silence beyond this world, one might imagine her standing beneath a vast African sky once more, a little girl reborn, barefoot in the dust, smiling as the wind carries her name home. The century into which Josephine Bakhita was born was one of both darkness and discovery. In the vast lands of Africa, where kingdoms rose and fell beneath the endless sky, another empire, unseen but relentless, spread its reach. The empire of human trade. From the coasts of the Atlantic to the deserts of the Sahara, millions were taken, bought, transported, and erased. It was an age when maps were drawn not with ink, but with blood and silence. Sudan stood at the crossroads of two worlds, the Arab north and the African south, the desert and the savanna, the caravan and the chain. Traders crossed the land under banners of faith and commerce, claiming they brought civilization. What they brought instead was profit, and with it, the slow unmaking of countless lives. When Bakhita was a child, the land still belonged to its people. But power was shifting. The Ottoman Turks ruled from afar, the Egyptians under the Khedive extended control southward, and European explorers began to write letters home describing the land of dark riches. For every map drawn, a village disappeared. For every route opened, a family was broken. The slave routes through Darfur and Kordofan were ancient, older than any empire. Long lines of captives walked barefoot for months toward Khartoum and beyond, bound for Cairo, Arabia, or the ports of the Red Sea. It was said that for every person who reached the market, 3 had died along the way. Yet the world did not look. The desert kept its secrets well. By the mid-1800s, European nations were publicly condemning slavery while privately profiting from its shadow. Missionaries preached freedom. Merchants financed the very ships that carried human cargo. The contradiction was the heartbeat of the century, progress built upon pain. And so, when Josephine crossed the sea to Italy, she was not simply a girl leaving Africa. She was history itself crossing a threshold. She arrived at a moment when Europe was beginning to look inward, to question its own soul. The industrial age had filled cities with smoke and workers with exhaustion. Faith was waning, power was shifting, empires were expanding in the name of God and prophet alike. In Venice and Verona, where she lived and served, the church struggled to define what mercy meant in a world grown hard. The Canossian sisters believed it meant presence, quiet service, steadfast love, the kind of holiness that does not shout. They did not yet know that within their walls lived a woman who would one day redefine that word entirely. Bakhita's story was not one of revolution or rebellion. She never raised a weapon, never led a march, never wrote a manifesto. Her revolution was invisible, fought within the soul. In an age obsessed with power, she embodied surrender. In a world of division, she offered unity. She became, unknowingly, a mirror in which both Africa and Europe could see themselves, wounded, searching, capable of grace. Outside the convent, Italy itself was changing. The kingdom had been unified only a few years before her arrival. Wars for independence had left the nation scarred, poor, and proud. The streets echoed with political speeches and church bells alike. And amid that noise, the image of a quiet African nun walking through the market in Schio, head bowed, smile gentle, became a kind of living parable. Shopkeepers greeted her with respect. Children followed her, whispering her name. To them, she was not foreign. She was peace in motion. They saw in her something beyond race or origin, the proof that goodness could exist without boundaries. Her presence in Italy stirred quiet conversations. Priests began to write about her in journals. Some saw her as a symbol of missionary success, a soul redeemed from the darkness of Africa. But others, more perceptive, understood something deeper, that she, not they, was the teacher. Her forgiveness, her silence, her strength, these were not learned from Europe. They came from a wisdom older than empire, older than conquest, a wisdom carried in the blood of every people who had ever suffered and yet survived. As the 20th century dawned, the world hurtled toward another storm. Industry, nationalism, and faith collided. Italy, like other nations, reached out for colonies across Africa, Eritrea, Somalia, Libya. The irony was cruel. While Europe celebrated the sainthood of its missionaries, it built new chains elsewhere. And within that paradox lived the memory of Bakhita, an African woman whose very life condemned the logic of empire without a single word of anger. Historians would later call her the patron saint of the anti-trafficking movement, but to those who met her, she was simply mother. Her holiness did not come from miracles or visions, but from the quiet defiance of love. She had turned every wound into prayer, every scar into meaning. In her later years, she was often asked by visiting priests to speak about Africa. "Tell us of your homeland," they would say, and she would smile. "My homeland," she would answer, "is where I first learned that God sees even the smallest bird." They expected stories of darkness, she gave them light. When she died in 1947, the world was just beginning to rebuild from the ashes of war. Europe lay in ruins, yet from those ruins arose the image of a woman once enslaved, now free beyond death. Her story spread slowly, then suddenly, across parishes, across continents, across hearts. In Sudan, her name began to be whispered again, first among the few Catholics in Khartoum, then among ordinary people who had never seen a nun, but knew what suffering meant. They called her the one who forgave. Decades later, when civil wars tore her homeland apart again, soldiers carried her image on scraps of paper, believing it would protect them. Mothers prayed to her for their lost children. Refugees whispered her name as they crossed deserts, not unlike the one she once walked. To the world beyond faith, she became a symbol of endurance, of reconciliation, of the possibility that history itself might heal. Her canonization in the year 2000 was not only a church ceremony, it was a reckoning. In the presence of African cardinals, European leaders, and thousands of believers from every continent, her story closed a circle that had been open for centuries. Standing before the crowd, Pope John Paul II spoke of her as a universal sister. He said, "She reminds us that freedom is not an external gift, but an inner victory. She teaches us that love is stronger than the chains that bind the body." As he spoke, the camera swept across faces, black, white, brown, weeping, praying, remembering. The square fell silent. In that silence, the centuries of pain that had divided continents seemed for a heartbeat to meet in understanding. For historians, Bakhita's life is a window into a world both cruel and miraculous, the twilight of slavery, the dawn of human rights. For believers, she is proof that sanctity can bloom in any soil. For those who simply seek meaning, she stands as a reminder that forgiveness is not weakness, but power of the rarest kind. Her story continues to resonate because it answers a question the modern world keeps asking. How do we live after suffering? How do we carry memory without letting it poison us? Bakhita's answer was simple: we carry it with love. Today, in the small Italian town of Schio, her convent still stands. Visitors from across the world walk the same narrow corridors she once swept, touch the same wooden pew where she prayed, and feel something indescribable, a stillness, a warmth, a presence that seems to hum with life. Outside, in the garden she once tended, roses bloom every spring. The locals call them Bakhita's roses. And in Sudan, despite war and displacement, a church bears her name. On its walls, children have painted her image, a woman in a dark habit, eyes soft, hands open. Below it, a simple inscription reads, "From chains to heaven." The world that Saint Josephine Bakhita left behind did not stay still. Her lifetime spanned the dying days of the old empires, and her death marked the birth of a new age, a century that would speak the language of rights, dignity, and freedom. Yet the chains she broke with her life did not vanish, they only changed their shape. Across Africa, the echoes of history lingered. Colonies gained flags, borders, anthems, but freedom, the kind she carried inside, was slower to come. The same roots that had once carried slaves now carried refugees, the same deserts swallowing names once more. And somewhere, in those endless lines of the displaced, in the eyes of mothers holding children too weak to cry, her story lived again. In the archives of the Vatican, her name appeared often after 1947. Missionaries wrote of her as a model for the African church. Bishops quoted her when speaking of reconciliation. But what they truly meant was that she represented what humanity had almost forgotten, that holiness can come from endurance, that light is born not from triumph, but from survival. By the 1960s, when independence movements swept across Africa, her image began to reappear, not as the symbol of obedience colonial missionaries once saw, but as a quiet challenge to the arrogance of empire. For Africans, she was not a woman who became holy because of Europe. She was a woman who revealed that sanctity had always existed in Africa. Her forgiveness was not submission, it was sovereignty of the soul. Artists began to paint her. In Lagos, in Dakar, in Nairobi, murals appeared showing a black woman in a nun's habit holding a key, not the key of a master, but the key of freedom. Poets wrote of her as the saint of broken chains. In Italian towns, schools were named for her. In Sudan, where war raged again, she was invoked as a protector. Her presence grew in ways that history could not measure. For human rights activists, she became a face for those still trapped in modern slavery, the women sold in hidden markets, the children forced into labor, the migrants trafficked across borders invisible to compassion. Every year on February 8th, the Church now marks the International Day of Prayer and Reflection Against Human Trafficking in her name. But her story is not only for believers, it is a mirror held up to the world's conscience. In her, we see what happens when cruelty meets courage, when the attempt to erase a life results in something eternal. If you visit Schio today, you can still see her room. The bed, small and simple. The rosary, worn smooth by her hands. The window, looking out to a courtyard where children play. The walls are silent, but somehow the air carries a pulse. as if every prayer she whispered still lingers, folded between the bricks. Visitors describe a peace that cannot be explained. It is as though her forgiveness has become part of the air itself. Scholars who study her writings note that she left behind almost no theological treatises, no long sermons. Her life was the sermon. Each gesture, each smile, each scar turned to grace was an argument stronger than any doctrine. Her simplicity confuses modern minds accustomed to spectacle. She performed no grand miracle. She did not heal the sick or raise the dead. Her miracle was more radical. She refused to hate. In a world addicted to resentment, that is the rarest wonder of all. The 21st century often imagines itself free from the past, yet it remains haunted by it. The legacies of slavery, inequality, prejudice, exploitation still flow beneath modern life like hidden rivers. When we speak of freedom, we often mean comfort. Bakhita's life reminds us that freedom begins when the heart refuses to be owned. In documentaries produced about her in recent years, filmmakers linger on her eyes. Photographs taken in her later years show a face marked by age, but alive with serenity. There is no bitterness there, only light. Historians debate facts, timelines, authenticity, but no one debates that she changed those who met her. The evidence is in their testimonies. To speak with her was to feel forgiven. As technology shrinks the world, her story travels faster. It appears in classrooms, in human rights campaigns, in art installations that project her image on the walls of cathedrals and refugee camps alike. In 2020, a bronze statue of her was unveiled in the Vatican gardens, taller than life, her hand resting on a young girl's shoulder, the chains at her feet melting into roots. The inscription reads, "No one is born a slave." And yet, her legacy is not a museum piece. It asks something. It calls. Because the story of Josephine Bakhita is not over. It continues every time someone chooses mercy over vengeance, every time a victim of violence decides to rebuild instead of destroy, every time a person learns to see the human being behind a stranger's face. She stands for the idea that suffering, while real, need not be final, that the human spirit, when anchored in love, can transmute pain into beauty. That dignity, once claimed, cannot be taken again. In interviews with survivors of modern trafficking, some mention her name without knowing her full story. She was the slave who forgave, they say, the saint who knew our pain. That is her afterlife, not bound to religion, but to humanity itself. The final image of her filmic story might be this: an open desert, dawn breaking. A figure walking barefoot toward the horizon, footprints fading behind her, wind rising ahead. The voice of the narrator, calm and resolute. They branded her skin with iron, but not her soul. They took her freedom, but not her grace. They silenced her voice, but in silence, she taught the world to listen. Fade to black, soft choir, the words appear. Saint Josephine Bakhita, 1869-1947, patron saint of human freedom, from chains to heaven. There are stories that end, and there are stories that stay. Josephine Bakhita's story does not end in Schio or in Rome or even in Sudan. It continues in the unspoken places of the world, in hearts that still ache, in eyes that still search for light through the shadows. To speak her name today is to remember everything that humanity tried to forget. It is to remember the nameless millions who were taken from their homes, whose histories were burned, whose languages disappeared between chains and salt and sea. It is to remember that for every Bakhita who survived, countless others did not. But it is also to remember that evil, no matter how vast, does not have the final word. Because somewhere in the machinery of cruelty, one girl kept her soul alive. One girl learned that the human heart, though beaten, can still choose love. And that choice changed the world. When the camera pans over the face of Saint Josephine in the Vatican gardens, the bronze catches the morning sun. The artist sculpted her eyes slightly upward, as if she were still looking toward a horizon no one else could see. Children walk past the statue on school trips. Some stop, some don't, but the light always finds her face. There is a quiet lesson in that. We do not always see the saints among us when they are alive. Sometimes we only recognize them in the silence they leave behind. Her canonization in the year 2000 was more than a religious event, it was a reckoning. The same nations that once profited from slavery now stood before the image of a woman they had once enslaved, asking her intercession. And she, true to her spirit, did not judge. She simply smiled. The world applauded her forgiveness, but perhaps forgiveness was not the point. Perhaps her message was simpler, that suffering is universal, and so is the possibility of redemption, that we are all capable of cruelty and therefore all responsible for compassion. Her legacy reaches beyond faith, into politics, into education, into art. In universities, her life is taught alongside figures like Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, and Olaudah Equiano, not as an Italian story or an African story, but as a human one. She is not remembered for what she endured, but for what she became. And yet, her presence still feels intimate. If you walk into her chapel at dusk, the light through the stained glass turns the floor gold. You can almost hear her voice, low, steady, forgiving. Not as a ghost, but as a guide. Not from heaven, but from memory. For the world she dreamed of has not yet come. There are still those who are sold, those who are silenced, those who are forgotten. The chains have changed their form, invisible now, woven into hunger, poverty, fear. And that is why her story must continue to be told. Each generation must retell it, not as a relic, but as a mirror, to remind us that freedom is not a gift we receive, but a truth we must protect. The story of Josephine Bakhita is not about sainthood. It is about what it means to remain human when the world denies your humanity. It is about the strength to say yes, yes to love, yes to life, yes to faith, when everything around you says no. Her final word, the night she died, was that single syllable, yes. And maybe that's all the faith the world will ever need, a single unwavering yes in the face of darkness. The screen fades to black. Soft strings rise beneath a single voice, calm, reflective, almost a whisper. They took her name. She gave them forgiveness. They took her freedom. She gave them peace. They took her body. But her soul walked free. Saint Josephine Bakhita, the slave who became light. Then silence. The silence of understanding. The silence of history remembered. The silence that invites us, the living, to continue what she began. Fade out.